Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Tesla Talk. This is our weekly podcast where we discuss everything about Tesla, Elon Musk, Starlink, and his other portfolio of companies. We will get the ball rolling here right away, and I'll turn it over to Sawyer for a brief introduction.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. With us today is Brendan Carr. He's one of the 5 current FCC commissioners. Thank you, Commissioner Carr, for tuning in.
Yeah, so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so a couple days ago, you posted sort of a headline-worthy letter or statement in which you brought to attention your strong disagreement with the Commission's recent decision to revoke a 2020 award of $885 million to Elon Musk's Starlink, an award that Starlink secured after agreeing to provide high-speed internet service to over 640,000 rural homes and businesses across 35 states. Starlink is sort of a reliable technology that we've seen benefit the lives of millions of people at a fraction of the cost of competitors. I think maybe we should start with, what is the purpose of the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Look forward to sort of getting into the details of this. And you're right. I think this was a really odd decision from the FCC. And as we'll sort of get into it, I think it really can only be explained, when viewed not through the lens of the facts or the law of this particular case, but through this broader lens that ties back to some statements that President Biden made from the podium right inside the White House. But as a table setter, back in 2020, the FCC launched this proceeding called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And effectively, we were taking about $16 billion, and we were targeting those parts of the country that were still stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide. So places that had, no internet service at all, or perhaps just, old copper line internet. And we conducted what's called a reverse auction, meaning we set a baseline price and we said, who's willing to bring high-speed service to this community for the least amount of federal dollars? So it involved competition. It involved bidding down, so it'd be a good value for the federal taxpayer. And ultimately, there was about $8 or $9 billion worth of funding that was won, and Starlink won just under $1 billion of that, as you noted, an award to provide high-speed internet for the very first time ever to these rural homes, rural communities, over 30 different states for under $1 billion. And they were supposed to start delivering that service in 2025. And so they still have years to go before they have their very, very first commitment. So in a nutshell, we were trying to get service to rural America in 2020. We did it through this mechanism. Starlink competed, Starlink won. And as you noted, Starlink is undoubtedly a very reliable technology. In fact, the federal government relies on Starlink when it matters most for mission critical type of applications for the military in particular. And so that's sort of the initial stage set is 2020. They won this, they secured the money, and they were going forward pursuant to that commitment to get that service to those rural Americans. And then flash forward to just this week, and for the first time, the full FCC, the full commission where I work, as you noted, it's 5 commissioners. So 3 are Democrat. It's always with the presidency. So 3 are Democrats right now. 2 are Republicans, myself and Commissioner Symington. And the FCC voted 3-2 in a party line vote to rake back that 2020 award to Elon Musk. And what was so interesting about it is when you boil down the FCC's decision, what it says is, we just don't think Starlink is that reliable of a technology. And, you can parse the decision itself and look at how, they invent an entirely new standard for Starlink to meet that they don't apply to anybody else. They just apply that standard to Starlink. It's a standard that, in fact, none of the other winners in that 2020 auction could have passed if the FCC had applied that to it. And so it's really a quite startling decision that, again, where we started from, I don't think it can be explained by the facts. And really, look, Elon Musk can be fine. Obviously, just under $1 billion isn't going to hurt him. But what the problem here is now we've got, over 640,000 rural homes, rural businesses that had a commitment to get high-speed internet for the first time. And the FCC has now vaporized it. And we've replaced it with nothing. And in fact, if you look at the back of the envelope math, if we were to ever come back there again and bring, say, fiber high-speed service to those communities, it would cost north of $3 billion. So rather than getting high-speed service virtually overnight for less than $1 billion, if we ever do go back there as a government, it's going to cost taxpayers over $3 billion. So I think it's just, again, it's a decision that you just really can't look at in isolation and say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense.
Commissioner Carr, first of all, I want to thank you very much for joining us. I think it's excellent that, you were willing to come and speak to a number of just everyday people about this issue and really highlight it. I have a question for you, I think, which is a great way to get this conversation started before we get into the specifics of this Starlink decision, which is that I feel that most everyday Americans, think that the bureaucratic structure of these federal organizations prevents them from being weaponized. And I feel that many don't understand the inner workings that allow for that to happen. So could you, from a layman's perspective, step by step, talk us through and maybe break it down for the audience as to how this weaponization is achieved in federal organizations and how 6-7 federal organizations are rounded up to pursue an individual?
Yeah, look, a lot of people are focused, obviously rightly so, on the presidency and the balance of power in Congress, whether it's the House or the Senate. But obviously, as a lot of you people know, DC is full of an alphabet soup of agencies that comprise the administrative state. Now, some of those agencies are what we call executive branch agencies, which means they are sort of directly beholden to the president. You can be hired and more importantly fired for no cause at all by the president. And then there's a separate set of agencies that are considered independent, which means you can't really be fired by the president except for sufficient cause. The FCC is an independent agency, but there's a blend. There's a blend again of executive branch agencies and independent agencies. And what's important here to remember is that if you look back, we're now approaching what will be 12 of the last 16 years. 12 of the last 16 years, the administrative state has been controlled by Democrats, meaning a Democrat has been in control of whether it's the FCC or FTC or Commerce Department for 12 of the last 16 years. So while the presidency shifts, while the House and the Senate shifts around, the Supreme Court can shift around, the administrative state has been in that condition now for approaching 12 of the last 16 years. And that's where all the action happens these days. I mean, Congress, rightly or wrongly, from your perspective, doesn't get a lot done. I would argue that's partly a product of our constitutional system. It's not supposed to be easy to get stuff done, but it is easy to get stuff done in administrative agencies. And again, by a simple vote of a majority of 3-2, the FCC can take almost, not any, but almost any action that it wants. And again, if you step back, we go back to where President Biden was last year. And again, he stood inside the White House at a podium that was adorned with the official seal of the President of the United States. And he said that Elon Musk is worth being looked at. There's a follow-up question that was asked, and they said, how? And he looked down, the president did, and said there's a lot of ways. And now the very narrow question that was asked to the president was about supposedly technical and financial ties to foreign governments. But I can tell you when a president stands at that podium and says Elon Musk is worth being looked at, that's a green light. And I think that's why you've seen this volume and pace in nature of administrative actions going after Elon Musk. Look, obviously it's the Department of Justice, Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Trade Commission, the NLRB, the Southern District of New York, even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And you can say, look, Musk runs a lot of businesses, so obviously he'll have a lot of run-ins with the government. Like, okay, I get that. But look at those individual actions. The Fish and Wildlife Service, they said that after a SpaceX launch, they found some blue crabs and a handful of bobwhite quail eggs that had been charred. And so they're wondering whether they should start an investigation on that. The NLRB was going after Tesla for dress code violations, for enforcing the rule that you had to wear a black T-shirt to work, which is actually an engineering thing when you get the details from Tesla on that. Or the FTC. The FTC was asking questions about what journalists did you give access to information that ultimately became part and parcel of the Twitter files. So this is why what I have said, and what I wasn't the first to say, it actually was the Wall Street Journal editorial board. They look at all of these little regulatory actions, and they said the common theme here seems to be regulatory harassment of Elon Musk. And I agree. And you don't need to find, some smoking gun memo that tells every single agency what to do. When the president stands at the podium and makes that statement, it's clear enough.
Yeah, no, I think that that's an excellent point, and I love the way that you explained that, and the leniency of these federal organizations to be able to act versus our actual branches of government. But I noticed yesterday in your CNBC interview, I liked the way that you phrased this. You said that the decision does not withstand the scrutiny that other FCC decisions would withstand. And as the commissioner of the FCC, I think you can answer this better than anyone could. How was this decision different from other FCC decisions? And how was it glaringly obvious to you that this was a weaponization of the commission?
Well, before I became a commissioner in 2017, so I've been in this job for, I don't do math very well, five or 6 years at this point. But immediately before becoming a commissioner, I was the general counsel of the FCC. So, I understand things from a legal perspective. My background as a lawyer, I've litigated a lot of cases. And what the FCC did here is, again, remember this. When Starlink won that award in 2020, we said, you need to provide high-speed service, we call 100 over 20 megabit per second, low latency service by 2025 to 40% of that 640,000 number locations. What the FCC did in this decision is they said, basically, since you aren't providing service today at 120 megabit per second to all of those 640,000 people, 2 years before the very first benchmark kicks in, we're going to find that it's not reasonable to conclude that you will ever be able to do so. So in other words, we effectively accelerated the 2025 deadline to 2023 and said, gotcha, you're not already there. And now, to the extent that to give the FCC the benefit of the doubt, they're saying, well, we're not really holding them to 25 today, but we're just saying it just doesn't look like to us he's going to make it in terms of being able to actually provide this quality of service by 2025. But that argument doesn't fare any better either, because again, is there anybody that seriously doubts the Starlink technology? And there's other low Earth orbit satellite technologies that are going up as well. Amazon Kuiper, for instance. So the technology itself plainly works. And in fact, again, when it matters for the federal government, they are engaging in multi-million-dollar contracts with Starlink to deliver high-speed connectivity for the military, for like important matters. So the bottom line is this expression by the FCC that we just don't think this is a reliable technology. It just doesn't seem credible. And again, it's holding them to a standard that no one else did. Again, back in 2020, we gave awards to companies that were deploying fiber, right? Wired connectivity. If we were to say to them, are you providing service today that you weren't required to provide until 2025? They say, no, I haven't even put the fiber in the ground yet. But yet that's not the standard that we are holding Starlink to. So it's concerning from that perspective.
Commissioner Carr, this program by the FCC to bring broadband to rural communities is really the thing I love to see the federal government doing. As a software engineer, I mean, the internet has been essential my whole life, and I think it can really change the lives of communities that have high-speed access to broadband versus those that don't. Is there another alternative here? Is there a way to serve these communities? Or are average American citizens and taxpayers really going to feel the brunt of this action instead of SpaceX or Elon Musk?
Yeah, look, the real loser here ultimately is going to be, those Americans that were going to get high-speed service pretty quickly here, whether it was another year or two away. We've now evaporated that commitment to get them high-speed service, and we've replaced it with nothing. There is one thing running in parallel here that I should note. The Biden administration is running its own broadband funding initiative called BEAD, and this was a part of the Infrastructure Act that passed 2 years ago. Now, there isn't a dollar yet from that BEAD program. It's a roughly $50 billion program that has actually gone into the ground. These areas are going to be eligible for funding through that BEAD program. But there's a couple problems with that. One, the cost estimate right off the top for how much it's going to cost in subsidies if you use the BEAD program to get unserved households is something like $4,900 in a subsidy per household. With Starlink, we were going to get these communities served for $1,300. So $1,300 high-speed service versus if, and again, it's not a guarantee, but if they get service through this other BEAD program, it's going to cost the American taxpayer $4,900. And in fact, because BEAD is running into a lot of problems right now because of increases in costs, it is very, very far from clear that BEAD is going to reach everywhere, let alone these areas right here. So yeah, I think the big loser here is these communities that could have gotten service quickly that may now never get it, or maybe they got to wait a decade. And the real loser is the taxpayer who got a good deal, $1,300 to serve a rural household versus the Biden administration's BEAD program, where it's going to cost them almost $5,000.
Yeah, it's funny you mention it. We actually have Brandy Cole here from Virginia. She reached out to us. She's in one of the communities, the rural communities that's been receiving Starlink. Brandy, do you have any thoughts you want to share on this issue?
Thank you for dissenting and allowing me to come share my story. I do have some thoughts. So when I moved to Southwest Virginia with my family from the city of Richmond, we had some culture shock. We had a very hard time finding internet providers. The Point Broadband fiber optic company is a small company here, but their cables stop. They can't make it through the mountain. We actually had dial-up when I first moved here, and it was a nightmare. We got approved for Starlink. And once we got that Starlink, it gave children in the schools here in Wise County schools access to the internet, a reliable, stable connection to where they could actually use their learning tools and their curriculums. And it made snow days a lot easier here for us. It actually changed the quality of life that we have here in Southwest Virginia. So Starlink really means a lot to us here in rural Virginia.
Yeah, that's stories like that we hear all the time. And what's so funny is you basically have the FCC sitting here in Washington D.C. saying everything you're saying isn't true. Don't trust your experience. Trust us here sitting inside the Beltway. This isn't a good technology. It's not a reliable technology. But again, even that argument, it just doesn't make sense because the government itself relies on the technology. And I think the way that you square that circle, my theory is this, is the Biden administration basically has what I'd call a hate-need relationship with Elon Musk, meaning the Biden administration needs Elon Musk and Elon Musk's technologies to deliver on the goals the Biden administration has when it comes to EVs and environmental issues. The Biden administration needs Elon Musk and his technologies to get to space, right, and to achieve our goals that NASA and other components of the government have. And so where the government has no other option, they are engaging with Elon Musk. They are spending a lot of money on Elon Musk's technologies. But on areas where the federal government itself doesn't see a need to use or support Elon Musk, then you see actions like this at the FCC, where we take away the funding that was going to be solely about rural Americans. Or you see, again, all these actions at the FAA and the FTC and the NLRB that is part and parcel of this regulatory harassment. I think all of this is explained by understanding this hate-need dynamic that's taking place. They're going to use Elon Musk. They're going to rely on him when they have no other option. But where they have another option, you're going to see this type of sort of, as I think it, this pattern of regulatory harassment.
Can you maybe explain a little bit deeper the quote-unquote novel specific standard that Starlink is being held to here?
Yeah, so again, what we did was the FCC took a Ookla speed test data from 2 periods of time, which is sort of a nationwide average, and said your Ookla speed test data shows that you aren't providing service today at 120 megabits per second, and therefore we don't have confidence that you will be able to provide 120 service in 2025. But again, Starlink had no obligation to be hitting 120 at this moment. Moreover, the obligation that Starlink had was to apply 120 to specific locations, not sufficiently today to satisfy sort of a nationwide average speed test. In other words, we've basically taken like a sort of like a pace car lap of NASCAR, where the car is going 30 or 40 miles an hour before the race even starts. And we've said, this car's never going to get up above, 60 miles an hour. And we just have never done that to anybody else. We've never said, you don't need to build out for 2 or 3 years, but we're going to take a speed test right now. And if you didn't meet your goal ahead of time, we're going to say we don't have confidence in you, and we're going to rake back the technology. Man, look, it's a novel technology to some extent in that it's involves rockets and going into space. But we're a sophisticated agency, and we understand, or we should be able to understand, how these technologies work. And again, the lack of faith that we are demonstrating the technology is belied by the fact that all these other components of the federal government are relying so heavily on it.
Right. I mean, Starship, they mentioned that they didn't think Starship could get more satellites to orbit. I mean, SpaceX is launching 80% of the payload to orbit for the entire world. They've received a contract from NASA to provide a lunar lander to put Americans back on the moon. They, with Starshield, are the communications provider of choice for our military. It is a little bit of a head scratcher that they would make this decision on one hand at the FCC and decisions at NASA and the Department of Defense that seem to belie that.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Yeah,
one of the things that the decision said was, well,
ahead.
Starship failed twice. And it was funny because you saw all this instant, I think, correct pushback on tech trade press when they said that Starship failed. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how rocket ship technology in progress is made. You're learning a lot. You're growing. And because we saw an explosion from here in DC, you don't say, wow, it's a failure, it's never going to work. You look at what did the data show and what is the actual hockey stick curve of progress that is being made. But moreover, all of these satellites that are up there already, I don't know if it's 5,000 or so, something like that, have gone up without Starship. And so I don't understand sort of the thinking that, even if Starship were to fail, which again, I think is a misreading of the scientific data, that somehow an indication that Starlink isn't otherwise going to get the satellites up there on the current payload pace that it has.
Tesla is sort of a big reason why the U.S. will meet the Biden administration's electric vehicle goals, and SpaceX, Starshield provides the Pentagon capabilities they've really never had before, and for a reliable and low cost, I might add. Why can't politics just be put aside here and recognize all the good that Starlink could do for these rural communities and that Elon has done and continues to do?
Look, again, I think it's hard to explain when you look at each of these individual decisions, NLRB, FAA, FTC, DOJ, Southern District of New York, FCC, none of them, I think, make any sense when you look at them as isolated pinpricks. It just doesn't line up. But it all does start to come together and make sense when you flash back to that White House podium when President Biden stood there and said that Elon Musk is worth looking into. I mean, the pace and nature and scale and type of the inquiries seem to me have accelerated pretty dramatically, both from that moment at the podium, but even before that, when Elon Musk announced that he was going to acquire Twitter and bend the platform's moderation practices towards an embrace of free speech. And I think fundamentally, we have to get back in this country to this embrace of diversity of opinions and diversity of viewpoints. And again, I really think it's hard to divorce some element of that from what we've seen the president say and the regulatory actions that have fallen. But it really wasn't long ago in this country that embracing diversity of views was a very progressive, in fact, viewpoint. In fact, if you look back, President Obama, right around the 2012 election, he went out to Silicon Valley. He went out to Facebook's, sorry, I'm just trying to pull up this thing real quick, went out to Facebook's headquarters, and he was talking, President Obama, about free speech on the internet. And he called it, quote, part of what makes for a healthy democracy. 2012, the free flow of information on the internet. Now, flash forward just 10 years, 2022, and a few miles down the road, President Obama went back to Silicon Valley and he gave a speech at Stanford University. And he talked about this free speech on the internet as, quote, a threat to our democracy. So think about that. In a relatively short period of time, 2012 to 2020, the view went from the free flow of information on the internet being part of a healthy democracy to a threat to democracy. And I think that's a reflection of a broader movement in this country away from an embrace of free speech. And again, it was historically a progressive position. The very first op-ed in this country, the modern day op-ed, launched on the pages of the New York Times. There was an editor at the time, it was 1972, John Oakes, and he said his reason for launching the op-ed page was that he wanted something different than what you would see written from traditional editors at the New York Times. John Oakes said that, in his words, diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we start insisting that everyone thinks the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy. And so again, I think it's very hard to divorce this sort of ire that you see from the administration directed at Elon Musk and see it as, entirely separate from this broader cultural debate we're having right now about free speech.
I love how you touched on a number of the details of the decision in your letter of dissent, which, is what should be done. But I think the summarizing point you made, which I loved that you included it near the end of your dissent letter, was when you said, I think the obvious point is that the Biden administration doesn't believe Starlink is risky. Otherwise, the Pentagon would not have inked a multi-million-dollar contract with them. And I know you reiterated this point, but I think that point alone is it makes this argument so obvious, right? It
Yeah, you're right.
makes
I mean, look,
the decision so glaringly
right.
biased.
I can go through and as we talk about and bore you with the particular standard of review and the exact components of how the RDOF system work. But at the end of the day, I think anybody can understand that the FCC deciding that as a fundamental matter, it's not a very reliable technology. It simply can't be squared with what either their lived experience is, as we just heard from that woman from Virginia, or from what they're seeing the federal government do when they really need connectivity.
Commissioner, if it's okay. Okay, go ahead.
Really quickly, yeah. The question I have for you, Brendan, is what specific changes do you think can be made to federal agencies to prevent them from being so easily weaponized by either the executive or by members of Congress in the future? Because I think regardless of whatever political persuasion people may be, I think that's something that every American would be in favor of, that these federal agencies aren't so easily used as tools to meet an agenda.
Yeah, look, again, as we started from, we're approaching 12 of the last 16 years where the administrative state has been under the control of one political party, and there's very, very little checks historically on the action of the administrative state. It's a total mission creep potential. There is something very important that is happening right now, though, that is a check on the administrative state, which is the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has been breathing new life into judicial review, and it has been sharpening and taking a harder look at agency actions and deferring to agency actions less. There's a Supreme Court case called EPA versus West Virginia, which basically says, before we're going to say that an agency has discretion to do something, we're really going to want Congress to be very specific in the legislation that it passes. Because again, for people that don't know, the way it works is Congress historically passes a high-level law saying, FCC, do something good in this area over here. And then Congress, cuts a headline saying, hey, we solved this really, really difficult problem. Well, they didn't. All they did was pass a law that tells an agency to solve it. And the agency says, well, I got lots of discretion. They just told me to do something good, and good is subjective, so I'm going to do all these other things over there. So ultimately what needs to happen is the Supreme Court needs to really tighten down on the discretion that it gives to agencies. And then this will kick things back to Congress. And now some people will say, well, look, Brendan, Congress isn't really very productive right now. They don't get along very well. And I get that. I spent a fair amount of time up there. But I'd say you really can't divorce the two things, meaning Congress right now knows that they don't need to compromise. They don't need to come to the middle. They don't need to actually very clearly solve a problem because they can rely on administrative agencies to do it for them.
Okay, Commissioner Carr, we cannot hear you, so you may have to try to either mute and unmute your mic. There we go. Okay, we got him back.
Look, if anybody knows, knows anyone that works at an agency that deals with communications, let me know. I could use some help here, I think.
We need to get you Starlink.
The irony of that is great. No, we can hear you loud and clear now, sir. Sorry about that.
I don't know where I dropped. I was on a really good rant there for a second, but I'm not sure where I lost you guys.
Yeah, I love what you were saying just about the American ideal of freedom of speech and its importance to us. And I think it's just really disappointing that instead of, holding this value sacred, things are now so ideological that it's become more about party than really helping people get internet access, bringing America forward at a time where it's so important. There's a lot of people in this space who are listening, who agree with you, who want the government to do the best thing for the people. What would you suggest would be a way forward, or what people in this space could do? Is this something that you think potentially the courts could invalidate? Is this something where speaking up, writing to the FCC could make a difference? What would you recommend?
Well, with respect to this particular decision on Starlink, the decision now falls back into the court of Starlink itself to decide whether they want to appeal. They can take this decision up to the DC Circuit. There's puts and takes. Obviously, I think there's a very, very strong legal argument, but you got to think through at the end of the day, okay, let's say you even win in the DC Circuit. The prize for winning is you're back here at the FCC with no real guarantee as to how that plays out. But stepping back from sort of the Starlink issue and going back to the free speech issue, I think it's important on all of us to really stand up for this culture of free expression, because what's interesting to me is not this idea that you should be compelled to listen to every single idea that you find detestable. That's not my view at all. It's not like what's that Sandra Bullock movie? Is it Birdcage, where they like force right. someone's eyes open? Like, I don't think that's how free speech works. But I think the question about censorship should be asked and answered this way. It's not a question of like, should speech ever not be censored, just to sort of use a blunt term, but it's the question of who should do it. In my view is that it should be decisions for individuals. If you want to mute someone, then mute them. If you want to block somebody, then block them. Again, you're not compelled. But the question is, where in the free speech ecosystem should that decision take place? Should it take place by the government? I don't think so. Should it be centralized in the hands of, say, Facebook or even Twitter in terms of making censorship decisions at the system level? Or should we allow all speech in the digital town square, and then the individual participants in the digital town square get to make their own decisions about who they want to follow and whether they want to block or mute certain words? So I think maybe the way is to shift the conversation from, should this one person get to sort of speak always and everywhere, to, if you don't like that speech, don't follow it. Mute that person or block that person. But this reflexive view that someone above me needs to be in a centralized position to make sure that consenting adults cannot have that type of a conversation, even when I'm not part of it. I think that's the cultural shift that has taken place that we need to push back on.
Commissioner, I want to be mindful of your time. Is it okay if we take one or two audience questions?
Yeah, go for it. I got to move across town, but hope I won't lose you again.
Okay. Larry, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Commissioner, you mentioned that, the Starlink people or SpaceX can go to the district court, DC circuit, and then if they win, they're back at the FCC. Could you explain what the legal course is and how it finally terminates one way or the other?
Well, this decision by the FCC from this week is a final decision by the agency. So one option Starlink has is just to accept this and move on. The second option that they have is to appeal this decision to the DC Circuit. And like I said, I think there's plenty of reasons why Starlink could argue, I think successfully, in my view, that this was a decision that should be overturned by the courts. And then if you win that, you're potentially back at the FCC, where the FCC would be asked to take a second look at it. Are you really sure that you want to go with your original decision? Now, it's possible that the DC Circuit could sort of go so far as to say, the FCC, there's no possible way that you could have denied this lawfully now or in the future. So we're basically effectively going to put their award back in place. But that would be the path forward. You can, just move on from here and not appeal it, or you can appeal it. But by and large, if you win, you're going to be back down here at the FCC again.
Dan, you got the next question.
Hey, thanks, Brendan. Really appreciate the time. I'm an ex-employee. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath because, like my profile picture, I'm doing some kettlebell swings, listening to this conversation. It's amazing. I guess my question from an ex perspective, what can we do as a platform that would help, in your opinion, support this mission that we are not doing already?
It's a good point. I think as I talked about, I think continue to empower individuals and giving them, all the tools that they need and would want to curate their own experience, and just move people away from, appealing to Silicon Valley and appealing to sort of XHQ to enforce speech. I think that's, directionally where we need to move move towards fundamentally.
Jeff, I think we'll go to you and then we'll maybe close it out.
Yeah, thank you, Sawyer. Thanks for arranging this. Thank you, Commissioner Carr, for your time and your transparency. Really quick, just a comment. I think it would be valuable maybe to invite one or more of the three dissenters to actually have a conversation on like their background and like why dissent in this case and what does it mean? And maybe, it's almost like you recreate this space when you have some folks from those rural areas as well and just have that conversation. I think the transparency on spaces is great. I learned a lot in this conversation, and I just wanted to thank the commissioner and maybe offer that suggestion as well of maybe one of his colleagues that was in the dissent would also be willing to have a conversation. We could probably maybe reach out to them if they're around.
Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that one of my colleagues would come on Spaces to discuss it. But yeah, you can try.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to do it. I talk to them every day. I mean, the thing is, like, they're all good people. We all get along. We have very strong policy differences to be sure, but they're good people. And look, obviously 99% of what we do at the FCC is bipartisan, is unanimous. Even some tough stuff we do together. And we get along even when we end up landing in different spots. But there's other tough issues that we're doing. I mean, look, we've got this entire Title II net neutrality proceeding that's back underway. I don't know how many of you survived the sort of the net neutrality repeal of 2017 that we went through, and we adopt this new set of digital equity rules for the internet, which I dissented from then. I think fundamentally that was just about imposing more and more controls. And again, I think, free speech on the internet is great. But I also think we need to make sure that the internet infrastructure itself, to the extent possible, really can't be canceled by the federal government. And so I think, the degree that the Biden administration is trying to get more and more control over the internet infrastructure itself through these digital equity rules, I think is a mistake as well.
I mean, that's the reason, right, though, Commissioner Carr, that people should be outraged at this, because I think a lot of people who, like the people on this panel, myself, Sawyer, and Omar, I mean, we're fans and supporters of Elon Musk, but the people who aren't, try to look at this decision and say, oh, boo-hoo, a billionaire lost $1 billion grant. But, I loved that in your letter of dissent, you're turning the corner and saying, look, it's not just about them losing the grant. It's about depriving Americans that would have had access to the internet that are now being deprived of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Elon Musk, as we talked about, is going to be perfectly fine without this, 800 or so millions of dollars. I don't think anybody should be shedding a tear from him from a financial perspective. But yeah, this is a raw deal for the rural Americans that are actually going to get service. I think that's what people should care about. But I also think people should care about what appears to be this trend of regulatory harassment. That I just don't think it is completely random that Elon Musk, buys Twitter, makes a commitment towards free speech, and all of a sudden there's this deluge of what I view as sort of meritless regulatory actions going after him. I think that's something that we should all care about as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Commissioner Carr, for, of course, being generous with your time coming on. I think your letter of dissent was a brave move, and hopefully the other FCC commissioners eventually change their tune on this Starlink topic. We'll see. But keep up the good fight on this, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, and happy to do one of these again.
Great. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, thank you for speaking out.
Thanks.
We appreciate it.
We need more people in our government that are willing to have these conversations and are willing to come talk to regular people about these things and keep the American public in the loop. I mean, it's kind of depressing, honestly, how few of our members of government, whether they're elected or appointed or whether they're members of federal agencies or whether they're members of Congress, how removed they are. So it's refreshing. I think if I were to describe you in one way after our first conversation together, Commissioner Carr, it's that was very refreshing to hear a commissioner of a federal agency just be that down to earth and speak to us in a really real way about what's happening at that level. So we very much appreciate you and would love to have you back anytime that you'd like.
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to do it.
Have a great day. We appreciate the conversation.